Thanks, Bruce, and hi, everyone. And I will also be at the conference next year, so please join me. All right, so today we are going to be talking about racial equity and fair housing, and we have two really great panelists. Darlene English is the Associate Vice President of Education and Outreach at the National Fair Housing Alliance. She works to educate the nation about fair housing rights, benefits, and responsibilities under fair housing laws to key stakeholders, including the housing, lending, appraisal, technology, and insurance industries. And she'll be followed by Maria Callahan, who is the investigations coordinator with Fair Housing Advocates of Northern California. They are currently the only full-service fair housing agency in Marin County and the only housing counseling agency in Marin County certified by HUD. And so with that, I'm going to hand it right over to Darlene to get us started.
Thank you so much, Ellie. It is such a pleasure to be here. Welcome to everyone joining this webinar today. I'm going to start my timer just so that I stay on time. And this is a presentation that I prepared for you as housing counselors, what you need to look for when working with your clients, looking for fair housing violations, just things to be aware of. Next slide, please. And I'm just going to I know all of you have had fair housing training probably multiple times. So I'm just going to do a brief overview just to lay out the context for my comments today. And then I'll go over some kind of red flags to look for in rental, sales, lending, and insurance. And then we'll just end with talking about kind of the role of housing counselors in relation to fair housing. So next slide, please. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Fair Housing Alliance, we are the only civil rights organization that's dedicated to eliminating housing discrimination and ensuring equal housing opportunity for all people and communities through education and outreach, member services, public policy, advocacy, housing and community development, tech equity, enforcement, and consulting and compliance. So that is who NAFA is. And feel free to go on our website and see about joining us as a member so that you can get more information and be up to date on any housing related matters. Next slide, please. So a lot of you are familiar with, obviously, the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which was passed 55 years ago. But when you're talking about fair housing, there are a number of other laws that come into play that you may be less familiar with. And just so I bring this up to say that fair housing laws can be kind of complex and kind of nuanced. And so we're not expecting you to be the expert on fair housing. There are our organization's an expert. There are a lot of our member organizations throughout the country are fair housing experts. So please refer to us if you have any questions. But there is a Civil Rights Act of 1866, which many people are less familiar with. And that law said that all citizens have the same rights as whites with regard to owning property. So we had that on the books in 1866. And then, of course, 1968, we had the Fair Housing Act that was adopted. And then in 1988, there were some amendments added to that. And then just so that you know, there are state and local laws that also have fair housing components. So wherever you live in the country, it's good to know what those state and local ordinances are for your part of the country. Next slide, please. So the purpose of the Fair Housing Act, obviously, we all know, is to eliminate housing discrimination. But there's also the second component, which is to promote residential integration. And that's the part that people are less familiar with. And that really is where we see things like Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing, where we see special purpose credit programs, these things that are used as tools to promote residential integration. Because for the duration of our country, we've had all of these laws that have been put in place to specifically segregate our communities. The federal government was instrumental in segregating our communities. And so it's necessary for us to have tools to promote residential integration. There's a quote by Ta-Nehisi Coates where he talks about the debt that our country has, where he uses an analogy of our country running up this debt. And then we stop using that credit card and we think our discrimination and our segregation is going to go away. But that's not how it works. You have to pay down that debt. And so that is where we look at things like affirmatively furthering fair housing and special purpose credit programs and other tools to help us to address to redress the discrimination and segregation that we've seen in this country. So our fair housing laws basically say it's unlawful to restrict or attempt to restrict anyone's choice by word or conduct in relation to participating in the housing process. So buying or renting a dwelling, and there are specific instructions about what's considered a dwelling, and I have a slide about that. But just know that it is basically any transaction, sales related transaction to housing, where our fair housing laws apply, and we do have protected classes. So when you think about fair housing, we can go to the next slide. When you think about fair housing, it's basically three features. There's the property that's covered, the protected classes, and the prohibited acts, which I will get into a little later. But talking about affirmatively furthering fair housing, maybe you have heard in the news, there's been some talk about what's going on with that. We had a new rule come out in 2015 that really clarified what affirmatively furthering fair housing looked like. And then with the following presidency, those rules were kind of rolled back or suspended. And so now the federal government is in the process, or HUD is in the process of finalizing a new rule so that we can fully implement the affirmatively furthering fair housing mandate. And that mandate is really to ensure that any program that receives federal funding is run in a way that actively works to overcome the lasting and harmful effects of segregation. As I mentioned, our federal government created the segregation that we have today with the laws that they put in place. And so now it's about trying to redress those that discrimination with different tools. And so the affirmatively furthering fair housing mandate does just that. And so we're just waiting for it to be finalized and implemented. But a key feature of that mandate is requiring cities, counties, states, territories, et cetera, to incorporate equity plans that have to be updated every 3 to 5 years. And those equity plans really look at each community. So each community is responsible for looking at themselves, holding a mirror up to say, what are the barriers to fair housing in our community? And it's going to look a little different for each community, which is why these equity plans are so specific to each city. And so they have to have community input. They have to, again, look at the barriers in that specific community that is interfering with people exercising their fair housing rights, with exercising access to good schools and healthy foods and jobs and healthy environments, all those things that people look for when they're looking for housing, and those barriers that are put in place to prevent people from accessing those things. So the equity plans is a process that is driven by data and includes local knowledge and input from community stakeholders like housing counselors. Next slide, please. So I mentioned protected classes as one of the P's, property protected class prohibited act. So when we talk about the fair housing law, we're talking about groups of people who are protected, and that is anyone that belongs to a race, which is all of us, anyone with a color. So they separate race and color because you can have discrimination within a race based on different skin tones. So race and color are protected classes, as well as religion and national origin. And those were kind of the original protected classes. And then sex was added in the 70s, I believe. And then people with disabilities and families with children were part of that Fair Housing Amendments Act in 1988. Next slide, please. And then I mentioned, depending on where you live, there will be other local, state and municipal fair housing laws that protect additional classes, such as marital status, source of income, sexual orientation. Some places protect political affiliation, Section 8 voucher holders, survivors of domestic violence, even personal appearance. Some municipalities protect that, and gender identification and expression. So make sure you know where you live what those additional local fair housing ordinances are and what additional protected classes are covered in your area. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, one of the P's, the property that's covered. Any apartments, houses, condos, construction sites, empty lots where a house will be built is considered a covered dwelling. Mobile homes, manufactured homes, rooming houses, transitional houses, shelters, college residence halls, PHAs, public housing authorities, all of those are examples of covered dwellings. Next slide, please. And so now we talk about prohibited acts, things like refusing to rent or negotiate to someone based on their protected class, failing to give them all the information, imposing different terms or different sales prices or rental charges depending on the person. And again, that's based on the protected class, would be a prohibited act. Next slide, please. For our realtors, steering people to certain communities based on their protected class, steering people to certain parts of a building, an apartment building. They may try to put all the families with children on the first floor in the back of the building, so they're close to the playground. Things like that might be considered steering or segregating protected classes of people. So those are things to look out for if you're helping people find housing and giving them referrals and advice. Just let them know that if they experience things like that, that could be a fair housing violation. Next slide, please. Discriminating in terms and conditions. So again, requiring different, setting different prices on a rental for the same square footage, the same layout, based on someone's protected class, or failing to process an offer, or delaying maintenance or repairs. We see a lot of that for people with disabilities, delaying the repairs that they ask for, the accommodations that they ask for. Those are things that are considered fair housing violations. Next slide, please. And then coercing, intimidating, or threatening or interfering with someone who's exercising their fair housing rights, retaliating against someone. If someone believes that their rights have been violated and they express that to the housing provider, and the housing provider retaliates against them or threatens them, so you better not, you better not file a complaint, that is a separate violation. So just another prohibited act that is that's prohibited. So next slide, please. So disparate treatment versus disparate impact. And I'm not going to get into this heavy because Maria is going to talk about this a little bit more. But disparate treatment is when you're treating someone differently because of their protected class, obviously. But then disparate impact is a little nuanced because it looks like a policy that is facially neutral, but then it has the effect of being discriminatory on a protected class. So again, Maria's going to talk about that. I'm not really going to get into it. If we want to go to the next slide, or actually the slide after this slide, maybe we can skip that one. Some examples of disparate impact: criminal record screening. So, saying we won't accept anyone with a felony or anyone with a misdemeanor. That's an example of a policy that could have a disparate impact, because we know our criminal justice system is so biased that a lot of the people who have been arrested and convicted are people of color. And so that could be something that's an example of disparate impact. And again, I'm going to let Maria talk further about that, but these are just some other examples um, of disparate impact. Can't think of the word I'm saying. So anyway, next slide, please. So some red flags. Now we're going to get into the red flags to look for when you're working with clients who are in rental situations, who are in sales situations, who are looking at lenders, and who are looking at insurance. Some of the things that just don't sit right could be fair housing violations. So these are things that you want to cue into when you're talking to your clients and you're hearing things. When the experience that they're having doesn't really fit the scenario. So they're getting information that's kind of different from what would normally happen for someone with their credit worthiness or with their income, with their debt ratio, things like that. If it just seems a little off, that might be something to kind of question. When someone has a gender presentation that's different from what's on their ID, and then a landlord is refusing to rent to them because of that, that could be a red flag. Denying reasonable accommodations and modification requests for people with disabilities. They have people with disabilities have a right in the fair housing law to an accommodation or modification. And we have done whole presentations just on disability rights. But if they ask for an accommodation or modification, the landlord has an obligation to either grant that or to engage in the interactive process with them to find a solution to their situation. And so, flat out denying any kind of accommodation and refusing to engage in the interactive process could be a red flag of discrimination. Requiring a voucher holder to make 3 times the market rate in income instead of 3 times the rent share. So people, with housing vouchers, they're paying a portion of that rent, but sometimes a landlord may require 3 times what the actual market rate rent is, and not that share that they're paying. So things like that could be considered discriminatory. And again, you just want to pay attention to those things when you're hearing that from your clients. Um, Next slide, please. So when you're talking about sales discrimination, so someone is trying to secure a loan, they're trying to purchase a home. If they have a situation where they feel like they're being tricked into different products based on their protected class, or steering to certain neighborhoods, not getting a response, they've called and called and called, and maybe it seems like they're not getting a response, but somebody else that calls would get a response. That could be things to look out for. Or if you're dealing with a real estate agent and they use terms like, oh, that's a spicy neighborhood, or this neighborhood was really a white flight zone. That's really just describing that it's a black neighborhood. And so these are kind of it's coded language that people use to kind of either steer you or discourage you from certain neighborhoods. And so those things you want to pay attention to if your clients are telling you that these are things that they're hearing. Next slide, please. So in lending discrimination, again, being pushed into a particular loan product, or encouraged to get into a different loan than what that credit worthiness makes them eligible for. Sometimes people with high income and low debt would be steered towards an FHA loan instead of a conventional loan. And those are things you want to say, why? Why is that happening? We've also seen some discrimination in lending with regard to parental leave policies. So some banks are saying, well, we don't want to close on a loan until you return from your parental leave. And that can be a discriminatory situation. So just want to look out for things like that. Limited English proficient consumers, sometimes they'll go through the process, and the initial part of the transaction will be in their native language. And then when it comes to signing the documents, they kind of switch over to English. And so, and may change the terms and conditions associated with that. So you just want to make your clients aware of things to look out for, and that would be one of them. Next slide, please. Insurance discrimination. So sometimes insurance companies decide that they're not going to write policies for lower value homes. I know where I live in Cleveland, Ohio, we had some lenders who said we won't loan for properties that are below $50,000. Well, if you know about the foreclosure crisis, many neighborhoods within the city of Cleveland, um, were just decimated by the foreclosure crisis. And so trying to rebuild those neighborhoods, a lot of those properties were selling for $10,000, $20,000, but people couldn't get loans to even fix them up because the lenders weren't lending to that low dollar value. And really, it was because of the fact that those properties were in uh, neighborhoods of color. And so, sometimes we'll see things like insurance companies don't want to insure multifamily properties with certain characteristics because they are mostly associated with Black neighborhoods or neighborhoods of color, or forcing a building owner to refinance or requiring different insurance because they rent to tenants with vouchers. Those are things to look out for in insurance discrimination. Next slide, please. And I know I am running out of time, so I will speed this up. But this is basically the end. So when we're talking about your role as a housing counselor, things that you can do is, now that you have the fair housing information, knowing when you hear certain things that maybe you want to let your client know, this could be something that a fair housing organization can help you with. So you really want to make sure that you refer them to the proper resources. Don't try to be detectives per se. You're not the one that needs to investigate these situations, but just kind of be spotters, because you dealing with clients are in the unique position to notice patterns with certain landlords or certain lenders, about how they're treating people based on the protected class. So when you notice those kinds of patterns, you want to make sure that you reach out to a fair housing agency. And sometimes your clients, they may have a bona fide fair housing case, but they just don't want to pursue it. It can be embarrassing. There's some shame associated with it. People don't like to be victimized or feel like victims, and so they may say, it probably is discrimination, but I don't even want to deal with it. I just want to move on. So even if that's the case, you having that knowledge can still relate that to a fair housing agency, because fair housing agencies can investigate complaints of discrimination, and they can look for those patterns themselves. And the federal government, HUD specifically, has noted that fair housing agencies are, and testing, fair housing testing is the best way to spot discrimination. So that is one thing that we are experts at, and so use us for that as a resource. Next slide, please. So I talked about the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing mandate and those equity plans. You can be instrumental in those equity plans because, again, you're in that unique position of working with clients directly. And so you can share your knowledge. When it comes time to get that community input, you can be instrumental in reporting what you've seen, and how you see people treated and what those barriers are that you notice in your community, and you can recommend strategies to help overcome those barriers, such as special purpose credit programs. So I know that that's something that people have questions about, because it seems like it could be discriminatory in the sense that it is targeted based on race. But the key thing to note again is that our country, um, really, the federal government demanded residential segregation. And so it's really incumbent upon them to undo that, the segregation that they've created. And because of that segregation and that discriminatory system that we've had, we have so many people. We have a bifurcated financial system. So we have people that use the popular capital markets, which is the banks and credit unions and savings and loans organizations. And then you have people who are kind of on the fringe and using the fringe financial services, such as the payday lenders, the buy here, pay here, things like that, because they were not able to get the traditional financial backing. And so that has created the situation that we're in now, where we're actually more segregated than we were 100 years ago. So one of the tools that we have to kind of redress that segregation that we've talked about is the special purpose credit programs. And they're actually not new. They've been around for over 50 years. And the federal government, through ECOA and HUD, have both approved of the use of special purpose credit programs, and there's guidance that I can share. Didn't have a chance to get it in my presentation, but I'll share it with Ellie so she can distribute it to you. But there's guidance from HUD that says these are programs that are uh, not only perfectly okay to use, but also necessary. And what they are, just so you have a idea, is that they are it's a tailored way to meet special social needs and benefit economically disadvantaged groups, including groups that share a common characteristic such as race, national origin, or gender. So as I mentioned, there is a program that's established and administered to extend credit to a class of persons who have customarily been denied the opportunity to participate in our traditional financial markets. So I can share more information on that at a later time, but I just want to thank you for your attention and time during my presentation, and I'll be happy to take questions later. But right now, I will turn it over to Maria Callahan from the Fair Housing Advocates of Northern California. Maria?
Great. Thank you so much, Darlene. Thank you for all that information. And I just want to start off kind of picking up where Darlene led off with the importance of directing. If you see any suspicion, direct it to your local fair housing organization. I'm an advocate and test coordinator here at Fair Housing Advocates of Northern California. So what that means is we get a lot of tips from either bona fide clients or people in the community that, red flags have been alerted about these fair housing issues, and whether or not there's concrete evidence, that's kind of our job to run the test and bring those complaints. So when in doubt, we always recommend referral to a local fair housing organization. We ourselves serve 3 counties in the northern San Francisco Bay Area, but there's a national network of fair housing organizations looking to assist. So next slide, please. All right, so Darlene touched upon the different theories of liabilities in fair housing cases. So I'll just get into a little more detail on disparate treatment and disparate impact, what those both mean, and then really focus in on disparate impact and specifically how this treatment shows up in a number of protected classes, calls we get at our organization, what it looks like kind of on the ground. So disparate treatment is, what a lot of people will think of when they think of fair housing violations. This is different treatment based on protected characteristics, whether or not it's motivated by personal prejudice or racial animus. So this would be a housing provider refusing to rent to a family with children for fear the property is not safe for children. So, on its face, it might not be motivated by prejudice, but a family with children versus a family without children are just being treated separately, and it's, really clear what that policy is. Disparate impact can be, a little less clear, but this is a policy, practice, or procedure that it's applied neutrally. So on its face, it doesn't appear to be discriminatory. It's applied to everyone, quote unquote, equally. But it does have a significantly greater discriminatory impact on members of a protected class. So just by implementation of that policy, certain protected classes will suffer more. So an example would be a homeowners association banning doormats, signs, or other materials in a hallway. On its face, does not appear to be a discriminatory policy. However, this would disproportionately impact observant Jewish residents wishing to post a mezuzah at their door. So, upon closer inspection, there is a protected class of people being impacted more negatively by this policy. And next slide. So again, Darlene went over, protected classes. This is just another review of those federally protected classes. At the federal level across the country, everyone is protected on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, sex, familial status, and disability. And states can enact more narrow protections for additional protected classes. So that's something that you want to be aware of in the state where you live and work, whether there's any additional protected classes that aren't protected at that federal level. So, but today we'll focus on federally protected classes. So next slide, please. So I'm going to get a bit more into familial status discrimination and how this can show up in a disparate impact context. Next slide, please. So familial status discrimination protects families, any household that includes at least one child under 18 years old, which is what most people would think of as this protection, but it can also include a person who's pregnant, a person in the process of securing legal custody of a minor. Also, foster children are included in this. So, it doesn't have to be just, a biological child of a parent. Next slide, please. So a very common policy that is, applied neutrally is an occupancy restriction. This would be a limit on the number of people permitted to occupy a unit, but it often has a disparate impact on families with children. So we see this very frequently. An ad posted for a one-bedroom unit saying, looking for a single person only. This policy is neutrally applied. They aren't specifically mentioning any protected classes, but when it's applied, it is unreasonably restrictive and has a disproportionate impact on families with children. So here we have an example. If a landlord refuses to allow more than 2 people to occupy a 2-bedroom apartment, they aren't saying no children. One of those 2 people could be a child, but it is going to disproportionately impact families with kids. So occupancy guidance that is federally, kind of accepted is the 2+1 guideline. So that is 2 people per bedroom plus 1 in the living room. So if you want to, be applying a policy that doesn't have a disparate impact on families with children, it would, in this case of a 2-bedroom unit, be 5 people occupancy. So yes, next slide, please. So race discrimination and criminal records, Darlene gave some examples of this as well, how criminal records policies can have a disparate impact on race. So we'll just get into a little more detail on this. Next slide, please. So given the disproportionate arrest, conviction, and incarceration rates of Black and Latinx people in the United States compared to their share of the population, we've found that housing providers' use of criminal records to screen applicants has a disparate impact on Black and Latinx renters. So the criminal records policy, if implemented, has to be tailored to be necessary to achieve a substantial, legitimate, non-discriminatory interest that cannot be achieved through a less discriminatory alternative. So have to take into account the nature and severity of the conviction. So an example here, a policy couldn't just be a zero tolerance policy for anyone with a felony conviction. That would not be considered to be the least restrictive means to achieve, the goal of the policy. Slide, please. Source of income, slide, please. I'd like to note that source of income is not a protected class under federal law. So certain states or local governments have protected source of income. So, housing providers cannot discriminate on the basis of if someone has, say, a Section 8 voucher. However, even though this is not a protected class federally, housing providers' source of income policies still may be discriminatory in places without source of income protections if it's neutrally applied, but disproportionately negatively impacts members of protected classes. So this data you can request, I believe, from local housing authorities. do a FOIA request and see, percentages of voucher holders in a certain housing authority service area. And if, say, the population is in the county is 3% Black, but 6.7% of the voucher holders are Black, then, more than double the voucher holders are more than double the share of the population. So in that county, source of income restriction in housing would disproportionately impact Black tenants or Black people seeking housing. So slide, please. All right, sex discrimination, slide please, is another federally protected class. And where we see this come up a lot in the disparate impact area is in policies regarding domestic violence. So the policy itself might not include or might not reference domestic violence, but certain zero tolerance policies that housing providers implement certainly have a disproportionate impact on women. So nationally, 85% of people who have experienced domestic violence are women. So if a housing provider has a policy of evicting tenants if police are called to the building twice in 6 months, on its face, that might seem to be a neutral policy with the goal of, protecting quiet enjoyment of other tenants. That policy does have a disparate impact on women, especially women who have experienced domestic violence may be forced to choose between calling the police, protecting their safety, and or keeping their housing. So that policy would have a disparate impact. Slide, please. Disability discrimination. I'd like to note here that disability discrimination, at least at our organization, we see a disproportionate amount of disability discrimination. A lot of times, disability runs, everyone, all other protected classes can experience disabilities. A lot of times they come hand in hand. So, and some federal protections are a bit broader in disability. So it's an area where fair housing law can have a large impact both on the population and in the policies that you can actually use. So slide, please. So a very common disparate impact, a policy that would have a disparate impact on people with disabilities would be a firm rent due date due on the 1st with, a $100 late fee if rent isn't paid on the 1st. So in this case, many tenants with disabilities receive their income with a disability check on the 3rd of the month. These tenants could request a reasonable accommodation to change the rent due date to be the 3rd, 4th, or 5th of the month, perhaps. If the landlord refuses to grant that request, or if they continue to impose these harsh late fees, tenants with disabilities are going to be disproportionately impacted by those late fees, that appear on their face to be neutral, but have this disparate impact. Slide, please. And that is an overview of disparate impact within, certain protected classes. Happy to turn it back over to Ellie for any questions.
Great. Thanks so much, both of you. As the person asking questions, I am going to take the liberty to ask the first 2 questions. So, well, this, and one thing is not something that I want to ask as much as something that I just wanted to comment on. So Maria, you spoke about the disparate impact for victims of domestic violence. And I know in many states, and I'm based in New York State, and I know around here, there were some nuisance ordinances that were put in place that ultimately were removed because it was seen as potentially disparate impact for domestic violence victims. And there was a lot of advocacy around that. So people may have been hearing and seeing about that in other areas as well. And then a question, Darlene, you talked a little bit about the special purpose credit programs. I know that you're going to send us some information and some links to guidance and so on that could be helpful to, for the housing counselors on the call to look at and to kind of understand the guidance. But I'm just wondering if there are any thoughts from either you or Maria about ways to really address lender concerns about around directly targeting race, because we so far there's many special purpose credit programs available, but as far as I know, none of them directly target race. They kind of try to get at it by using a neighborhood designation or a zip code designation, and have not gone to doing directly targeting by race. And what we hear is that they are nervous and afraid about fair housing violations, right? So just wondering if you have any thoughts about how a housing counseling organization or advocacy organizations might be able to really talk to lenders about easing their minds and their attorneys' minds, I'm sure, about this process for SPCPs.
Yeah, I would refer people to the HUD guidance that is out. And I was trying to pull it up, but I cannot right now. But basically, HUD has language in the guidance that says this is okay, basically. And then the Equal Credit Opportunity Act also has some guidance. So I'll try to find those links and send those to you. But there, like you mentioned, there are programs that are utilizing special purpose credit programs. I know there's one in Boston, there's one in San Diego. Bank of America issued one in Los Angeles. They introduced a community affordable loan solution to expand homeownership opportunities in Black and Hispanic communities. So, and then Chase has one as well that is targeting minority communities. So there are definitely ways to go about doing it. And again, it's about affirmatively marketing and affirmatively furthering fair housing for communities that have been historically disadvantaged in the housing and credit markets. It is undoing something that the government mandated, years ago with their housing policies. So that's why HUD has come out with guidance that says this is something that is not just acceptable but necessary to redress the discrimination that we see.
Thank you so much. I just want to add briefly that at least it's our organization's understanding that a lot of the concern around these programs has come out with the recent Supreme Court rulings on using race conscious criteria in college admissions. And just to note that these programs, the legal standard used is, since this involves race, it would be under strict scrutiny. And that these programs have been specifically written to meet that strict scrutiny standard. So they wouldn't be, ideally they wouldn't be, have the same judicial holding as those college admissions cases.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to get to the questions that have come from our attendees. So this person says they are working with a few building owners and they have proposed an opportunity for our housing agency to partner with the owners to educate their tenants on credit. We have gotten some pushback from some of them. What questions could we ask of the property owners that would be a red flag for discrimination?
I'm a little confused by the question. Is this person concerned about the questions that they ask being red flags, or are they um, looking for the red flags that the building owners might say? If that makes sense.
Okay, so Phyllis, if you can kind of clarify your question a little bit, we'll get back to it. Okay, so this one is just kind of a comment response to something that you said, Darlene. As a previous mortgage lender for 25 years, with all due respect, I'm not sure the reason lenders will not entertain low dollar mortgage is only because of the neighborhood, but lenders have a minimum dollar amount they need and want to earn per loan. And if the dollar amount isn't high enough, they're actually losing money that can't be recouped.
Yeah, I understand the comment. And I believe that there are lenders that are smart enough to design products where they can recoup that money, even if it is a low dollar amount loan. And actually, some of our lenders have done that because of various lawsuits about the low dollar amount being having a disparate impact, and so they've come up with different solutions to address that need. So, of course, it's not every lender that is, using the low dollar amount as a means to discriminate, but more often than not, when it's used in certain neighborhoods, it looks like it has a discriminatory effect. And so, there are ways to circumvent that cost benefit analysis.
Okay. All right. This is directed at you, Darlene, and I'm going to say this person's name because they say hello. Angela Coder. Happy Thursday, Darlene. I had a question about occupancy limits. Is there a max per room occupancy standard?
Hi, Angela. Good afternoon. Thank you for the question. The federal government has a general rule of 2 people per bedroom. However, there are occupancy standards in different municipalities. So you really have to know what the municipality's occupancy code is. It's generally some square footage mixed with how many bedrooms there are that determines how many occupants can reside in a unit. But the general, in absence, not every community has occupancy requirements. So in absence of those, the federal government says general rule is 2 people per bedroom.
Okay. Can a faith-based homeless shelter discriminate if they are funded by private donations? You're muted, Darlene.
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking out loud. I'm never going to say anybody can discriminate, but I understand the question. And there are certain restrictions for religious housing. They can have requirements such as you have to be a person of that faith to live there. So there's that religious um, kind of preference for, if I'm operating Catholic housing, you have to be Catholic to live here. But aside from that, a lot of times there is no discrimination that's protected in those situations. I don't know if Ellie has a different or other experience or information.
Or Maria, I think.
I'm sorry, Maria.
Yes.
Who did I say? It doesn't matter.
That's
Sorry,
okay.
Maria.
That was my understanding as well. And I'm assuming that the question is specifically religious discrimination only. It's not, being privately funded doesn't mean you can discriminate based off any other protected class. And I know faith organizations can discriminate, like you have to be, a Christian to live in the pastor housing, but I actually don't know in the shelter context if there can be discrimination on the basis of religion for a shelter. That's something I would definitely want. I would want to double check before saying yes. So
sexual identity is one of the hot button issues there, key issues. But whether you go to women's shelter or men's shelter, depending on how you identify versus how you were born. So how does that play out there?
No, it is illegal to discriminate based off the Supreme Court has held in an employment context that gender identity is included under sex discrimination, and generally the housing discrimination law follows the Supreme Court holding in the employment context. So that would constitute sex discrimination.
Even though it's a religious organization.
Yes, that's my understanding.
Okay. So there was a related question here that disappeared. I don't know what happened to it, but I remember it. But it's related to if somebody is an owner occupant and they're renting a second unit, can they say that they only want a single person?
I saw that question as well. Sorry, Darlene, did I jump in? Go ahead. Okay.
No, you go ahead.
I saw the question as well. And my interpretation was they were asking the owner occupies the same unit and they're renting out a room in that unit.
No,
Oh,
I don't think so. It's like a two-family house, right? So the owner lives on the first floor and they rent the second floor.
okay. In that case, no. They would have to follow those federal occupancy guidelines that Darlene mentioned.
Okay. Well,
But let's
while
ask
you're
about,
at it though, let me ask you, since you were going with a room in the house, what's the answer to that?
So that I know there can be local ordinances regarding. I know at least where we operate, someone renting out a single room in the owner occupied unit can, rent it out to, can specify just one single person in that room. But if it's a separate unit, if it has a separate entrance, kitchen, bathroom, those are the things we would look at. If it's its own unit, then no.
Sorry, Bruce, did you have something that you wanted to add?
I had the same question you did. Perfect.
Oh, okay.
But actually, while I've got there, it turns out I can't put in something in the Q&A, I guess. So I wanted to ask about fair housing violations in the home buying aspect. So if you've got insights on that, and then also around home, if somebody's a homeowner and maybe is having problems with their mortgage, if there are any insights you've got on that, because that's a big part of both of our businesses.
Could you be more specific, Bruce, about what you're wondering about in both contexts?
Yeah, so well, I mean, all I'm trying to say is that tell us examples of things that if you're doing pre-purchase counseling, you should be on the lookout for. So
When somebody is looking to buy a home, what are things they should be looking for discrimination? Like one of the things that we've heard about, we don't have any actual proof of it, but we have heard anecdotal stories of home buyers being told they aren't eligible if they're to buy this particular home if they are using an FHA mortgage, or if they're using a down payment assistance program that they're applying for, that kind of thing. So are there any other items like that a housing counselor should be paying attention to?
We've done some investigations in that pre-purchase context, specifically, at least since I've been doing investigations around race, national origin, and gender familial status. So if an applicant is calling saying they're on maternity leave, are they being treated differently, given different requirements than someone who's not on maternity leave, or is a Latina applicant being given different information than a white applicant? So if someone suspects that they're being treated differently in the pre-purchase context based off a protected class, I would definitely recommend they contact a local fair housing organization, because that's a type of testing that fair housing organizations do. Have testers call lenders, match those protected characteristics, and try to get to the root of why that treatment is happening.
So, I mean, I think one of the places where first-time home buyers and especially people of color are really damaged in is this whole requirement that people are told, well, they're not accepting anything but cash offers. And this is, I mean, you're in California, it's huge there, but it's actually around the country. So is there any work being done on that? Is there any insight about if these are fair housing violations?
I mean, there's definitely work being done and advocacy being done by our organization, because there's so much data out there about who is negatively impacted by those types of policies. And we did a study in 2019 that looked at some data, HMDA data, and found that Black applicants are denied mortgage loans at twice the rate of white applicants, and Latino consumers are denied at almost 1.5 times the rate of white applicants. And so a lot of it has to do with, as I mentioned in my presentation, that those financial markets and what people have access to, and what people have been denied for generations upon generations. And when you look at how people are purchasing homes and how they've always purchased homes, has been either you or how people acquire homes is either you inherit a home from a family member, or a family member gifts you money for your down payment. And when you look at those two situations, think of who has been left out of that, who has been excluded from that because of the segregation, because of the discrimination in our financial markets and our housing markets. And so now is a situation where, the third scenario is where you work hard and you save up for that down payment in order to purchase a home. But like you said, there's a lot of purchasing that's happening right now, that are taking cash, that are only taking cash. And that is, again, leaving out huge swaths of the population, because not everybody has cash laying around. And so we're seeing more and more LLCs and companies purchasing housing, which is keeping people out of the housing market. And that's why we have such an affordability crisis. But just know that that is one of the things that NAFA is working on and advocating for. And that's another reason why the special purpose credit programs are so necessary, to kind of combat some of those things that exist in our markets.
I also just want to remind everybody that Darlene did have a slide that talked about some specific examples, specifically around what a real estate agent might say, and trying to steer them away from certain neighborhoods. And thank you to Deborah Davenport for kind of reminding us of that. She mentions realtors steering people. Okay, somebody would like to know where they can report housing discrimination.
Great question. So depending on where they're located, there may be a fair housing organization in their area. I think on my last or second to last slide, there's kind of a resource page that has information for HUD, and also all of our NAFA member organizations around the country. But anybody can report housing discrimination directly to NAFA. We have a link on our website that says report housing discrimination. And like I said, most of the fair housing agencies across the country have a mechanism for reporting that discrimination. But you can also go directly to HUD. You can go to your state agency. I know Ohio has the Ohio Civil Rights Commission, where people can go and report housing discrimination cases. So it just depends on where you are, and look for those resources in your neighborhood.
Okay. Can a landlord state that they do not accept Section 8 voucher? And then another question related to that from the same person. If a customer has been grandfathered in due to them having a Section 8 voucher, but the property no longer accepts it, can the landlord refuse to re-sign their lease due to them being on a housing voucher?
So at the federal level, there is not a protection for Section 8 vouchers. However, again, focusing on disparate impact, if this is in a locality where there is not a source of income protections, but Section 8 voucher holders are disproportionately Black, Latinx, women, families with children, and especially if this client belongs to one of those protected classes that's disproportionately impacted, then there could be a case that this is discriminatory. And And regarding being grandfathered in and refusing to re-sign the lease, I do believe that that would be, legal unless, again, it falls into one of those, that disparate impact situation. And of course, if this locality does have source of income protections, then it's illegal in both cases.
And where can someone go at the state level to determine if their state has that protection?
So in California, the California Civil Rights Department has their regulations and laws on the website. So I would just, Google like Illinois state fair housing law, and anything.gov. It'll be probably one of the first results. Or call your fair housing organization and they can tell you.
Great. Okay, so this question, I'm going to give one answer to this question, and then Darlene and Maria, you can feel free to additionally answer. Can you file a complaint against your servicer if they are not being cooperative, as far as giving misinformation or just being constantly passed to the next rep and not getting any answers or help? So this is an ongoing issue in the loss mitigation world. Two things I want to say in response to this question. First of all, we do have an escalation list that is specifically for housing counselors to utilize. So if you don't already have access to this escalation list, please send me an email and I will get you the link, and I will give you the super secret password as long as you are a HUD-approved housing counseling agency. The second thing I want to say is file a complaint with CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. They are monitoring this. They won't give you like an immediate one-on-one answer. The servicer, however, is required to answer the complaint in some way. Those answers aren't always very satisfactory, but it does kind of alert the servicer that there is an ongoing issue. And what CFPB does is once they keep track of all of these complaints, and if they're seeing repeated complaints from a specific servicer, it can start to it can get them moving on some sort of enforcement action on that servicer for repeated violations of the servicing rules. So that's my answers, and I'll open it up to Darlene and Maria if they have any other thoughts.
Those are great answers, Ellie. I'm so glad that you all have an escalation list. I think that's a huge resource. And I'm so glad that you mentioned the CFPB, because that is the kind of thing that they would want to see. I would just add that in addition to them, it would be worthwhile to report it to a fair housing agency locally, because if they've already heard complaints about that servicer, then that gives them more credence to investigate them, or that may start an investigation that they can conduct and maybe find patterns of discrimination based on a protected class. So I would do all those things.
Great. Okay. And I just want to say our escalation list is pretty comprehensive, but it doesn't have every single servicer out there. So we do the best that we can. Let me know, and you'll see who there is available. All right, so this is a really long question. It looks like somebody has sent me information about a class, a homebuyer education class, and that they referred a client due to rent disparity, Black paying more than white tenant. Legal closed the case, saying that it was not discriminatory because she signed the lease. However, she was not aware of this until after signing the housing authority lease. So I'm not quite sure how the homebuyer ed class is related to that. But anyway, let's just go with the question about she was paying, this Black client was paying more rent than a white tenant. And then it was not seen as discriminatory because the Black client signed a lease. I'm sorry, I'm kind of interpreting here as I'm reading it, but she was not aware of all of this until after signing it. And this is a housing authority, apparently.
Oh, a housing authority that, so, well, I'm not going to assume anything. I will just say that that's something that should go to a fair housing organization. Um, there have been situations where fair housing organizations have had to sue public housing authorities for not following fair housing laws. So, that how there are so many situations where discrimination is happening, and there's been an estimate that at least 4 million instances of housing discrimination happen per year but go unreported because people don't know. How would you know that your neighbor is paying more or less than you, unless you have those conversations, and not everybody is having those conversations. So that's definitely something that, regardless of when she signed the lease, if she becomes aware of that, that's a discrepancy in, probably the terms and conditions, or discrepancy in offering the rental to people based on their protected classes. That's different. So I think that is certainly something that should be taken to a fair housing agency or the state's, human rights commission, or whatever the entity is in that area, to address that. Even if the PHA's legal department says that's not a legitimate case, I would take it to a third party, a fair housing agency, to have them investigate.
So this person has put into the chat, Fair Housing referred the tenant to legal services, who then closed the case saying that it wasn't discriminatory because she signed the lease.
I would just say, in this case, it sounds like unfortunate management of the case by both Fair Housing and legal services in this area. But I would also like to highlight that one benefit of being able to file federally, anyone in the country could file their discrimination complaint with HUD or with your state agency. And filing those fair housing complaints, the statute of limitations is 1 year. So, that is whether or not someone signed a lease, that case would still be timely. And you don't need an attorney to file a complaint. They're free to file. And the process is, pretty much designed for people to be able to represent themselves through the process. So in that case, ideally fair housing or legal services wouldn't have handled it that way, but the person who experienced discrimination could absolutely still file a complaint with HUD or their state agency.
So somebody has put into the chat, for PHAs, the rent is based on income in most cases, which would cause rent for the same bedroom size to vary. So doesn't mean it's not worth it to file the complaint, because who knows? Okay, so I don't know if either of you know the answer to this question. Bruce, I don't know if you know the answer to this question. Where can you find data on who is a Section 8 voucher holder in your area?
We recently did a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act, just to a local housing authority. We thought maybe a long shot to get that data, and they sent over some great data really quickly. So obviously not individual people, but breakdown by race versus, the race, ethnicity of the county at large. So FOIA request can't hurt.
Yeah, I mean, we have also the experience in Kansas City with the Let's Make Home the Goal program, and Ches had a relationship with the housing authority, and in order to promote the event, it ended up doing an email to all the recipients. So we didn't get the list. I believe that what it was that the housing authority put the email out. But I think, people do have some privacy protections too. So that may be why it's not available.
And this is just a comment with a little bit of a question at the end. I think that this is our last one. Realtors often discourage clients from accessing down payment assistance programs, and or if listing the property, discourage the seller to accept offers with down payment assistance. Is this a form of discrimination, and who should we report it to? Oh, Bertha, you have flummoxed our panelists.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that, unfortunately. I don't. I need to think about that some more.
I mean, could we actually maybe ask NAFA to make a deep dive into this question? This is very fundamental to home ownership in America and to Black and brown home ownership. And it's sweeping through the country and has been really had a negative impact.
Yeah, and we heard a lot about it, or during the height of the pandemic, when there's all the cash buyers and private equity just kind of sweeping up all of these low dollar houses, right? All the affordable homes, and people, first time buyers and lower wealth buyers, were trying really hard to get these properties and couldn't because they were waiting for down payment assistance, or they had an FHA mortgage, and they were kind of being pushed aside because of that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It's been all over the country, and we've heard about it too. And I would ask if you guys could just email me that, and I'll see if that's something that our um, policy team or research team is already looking into, and if not, if that's something we could put on our radar.
Well, that'd be great. And so we should probably go for the whole package. So it's cash buyers and refusing to pass on offers that include a mortgage, but also down payment assistance, FHA loans, VA loans, USDA loans, all those things that are disadvantaging our buyers.
I mean, I mean, if you could, it could be studied in a way looking at disparate impact, because who are the populations of people who are most likely to use FHA, down payment assistance, VA loans, those types of things. So yeah, if there's a deep dive done, I have a feeling that um, it's possible that those denials would have a disparate impact on certain groups of people.
So a couple more things have popped in. Somebody said a bigger problem is that realtors want buyers to provide a picture to obtain the house. And then she comments, such a fair housing violation.
A picture of the individual that wants to buy the house?
Yep.
What would be the justification for that? I wonder.
Yeah. So these kind of things like this that we have been trying, if any, but when somebody talks about this, about these kinds of things, like, do you have any in writing proof, right? Because yeah, we hear the stories, right? But we're just we need things in writing. We need proof of the stories. Not that we don't believe, but you got to have the proof, or you can't do anything with it.
So whoever sent that question in, please send it to us and to NAFA, or we'll share it with NAFA. But this is really helpful and disturbing information, and so if it's if there's anything in writing, that's great. If it's that a real estate agent said it to someone, get a statement from them. Anything we can do that creates a documentation trail.
And again, I would just add that when you hear or see things that seem a little off, um, to, if you can, ask what is the justification for those types of policies. Why do you need a picture of the home buyer? um, why do you have to have a cash buyer? Why, for any of these things that you're encountering, try to find out what the justification is that they're giving you, because that can, when fair housing organizations investigate possible violations, they're looking at patterns and looking at what is the company's practice, what things that they're telling people, uh, what is their policy, what is their procedure for picking renters, this one over that one. Is there a procedure for how you decide who you're going to rent to or who you're going to sell to, or anything like that. So as much as you can, like Bruce said, document these instances, and if you can, find out what is their justification. What do they say their justification is?
So the person who put this in has provided some more clarification in the Q&A box. So this is it's the seller, it's the buyer's real estate agent saying, give me a picture. So this is like the love letter thing, right? Give me a picture, write something down about how much you love this house and why you're the right person to buy the house, as a way to kind of pull at the seller's heartstrings and to pick them over over a cash buyer. And so I know that National Fair Housing Alliance has put out paper on this issue, in that it can be it can be seen as creating disparate impact, because now you're potentially also keeping out certain people because of race or gender identity or whatever, if they're providing a picture or a love letter kind of thing. So
I got to say though, it's very difficult to be an owner occupant buyer, and this does give people a leg up. So I understand the contradictions here, but on the other hand, part of the narrative we were trying to work on is, can you sell to somebody else who would be able to raise their children in your house? And that, if that becomes illegal under the Fair Housing Act, it means there's one less tool that that people who would like to be an owner occupant have. This is a very difficult problem, and I understand both sides of this question.
yeah. And so this person said that they are on the board of directors for Northwest Fair Housing Alliance, and they have yet to solve this problem. And the policy is being taught as a strategy to new real estate agents. It's a shame that it's come to this, but as rates increase, sellers are less likely to get a cash offer, which is better for our first-time home buyers. Now they can have home inspections and appraisals again. Okay, so questions keep popping in. I always thought a seller of a home is allowed to discriminate as long as they don't own more than 3 units. Is that not the case?
That is not the case. You cannot discriminate in a housing transaction based on, we talked about the protected classes. So regardless of, if you're the owner occupant, if you're the home seller, if you're engaged in a housing transaction of a property, you're bound by the fair housing laws.
Okay, so there is a question in the chat. Let's see. I have heard listing agents telling me clients are hoping for a conventional financial offer and not FHA. Is it okay for them to say that? They normally say my client is after a cash or conventional financial offer. So is that okay for realtors to say? These are the sellers agents.
Right. Unfortunately, it is okay. It is legal as of right now. Um, but again, looking at who it negatively impacts when you put those stipulations in place, it can be problematic. It can be seen as discriminatory. Whether or not it is, that's up to an administrative law judge or some authority to decide. But it can appear as though it's discriminatory, even though it is legal.
It feels like disparate impact.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that is the end of our questions, and thanks to both of our panelists for your wonderful presentation and for answering all of these questions. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Bruce for him to wrap it up.